everybody, and welcome to OSU Extension Agronomic Crops Team's first ever virtual corn college and soybean school. I'm Mary Griffith, Extension educator in Madison County, Ohio, and I'm one of the Agronomic Crops team leaders along with Amanda Doritas and Laura Lindsay, and the three of us will be moderating throughout the day. So thank you for joining us. Good. Welcome this morning, Steve. I'll hand it over to you. Thank you for being
great.
here.
Thanks, Mary. Great. Well, thanks for having me this morning. Just going to talk to you a little bit about meeting nutrient needs in corn and kind of thinking about some of the main pieces. I will say, for those of you that aren't familiar, we have recently updated and rolled out our tri-state fertilizer recommendations for corn, soybean, and wheat. And so a lot of this is going to be based on what we really found over the course of a 5 or 6 year project to essentially comprehensively revise the fertility recommendations. And so if you haven't seen it, it's a free PDF download. You can buy a printed copy from the OSU Extension Publication Store. This is just a quick link that will get you there. There's a lot of people to thank in this whole process. There are a lot of people that had their hand in it. And so, a lot, again, too many to kind of to touch on here, but I'll move, in the interest of time, I'll just move on and say that this is a really nice resource that's been kind of comprehensively updated for you all to dig into if you're interested. So really today, I just wanted to talk a little bit, just go through what I consider the main, from my experiences and collectively, and just talking with growers and consultants and the work that we did and thinking about what are the main pieces here. And so, of course, when we think about, and really this talk will just simply be structured as going through and talking about the different nutrients in order. We'll start here with nitrogen. I'll recognize that nitrogen is a critical piece in terms of corn meeting its yield potential. And we can think, with all of these nutrients, but particularly with nitrogen, and for our perspective, where we've got source, timing, placement, and rate. For nitrogen source, we get this question from time to time. We did run a few source trials with no differences in yield. The take home here, there's been a lot of work done on this in the tri-state region in particular, before the 1995 version was released, and then we've kind of done pieces here and there, but there's really, the take home is that there are many good sources of nitrogen out there. And the decision should be based on not on the source itself, but on the equipment, the price of the nitrogen, the potential for loss, and with your management and your application equipment. And so, that's kind of for me, the issue of like what kind of nitrogen source you're using is not a terribly important or particularly interesting question. It's like, that varies, of course, across the state in terms of availability and with some places having running more anhydrous than not. UAN, of course, becoming increasingly more and more popular and just as a flexible nitrogen source. So for placement and timing, there's always a risk. And this is kind of a conundrum, right? This is like you're rolling the dice nearly every year in terms of supplying enough nitrogen early in that crop's growing season, and then reducing the risk of nitrogen loss. So we know that nitrogen is a very dynamic nutrient. It's very susceptible for loss in the environment, primarily through too much water, in the early growing season. We know that we need a fair amount of nitrogen in the early part of that corn's life cycle for us to actually reach our full yield potential. And so those are always going to be kind of trade-offs between the risk of loss with a lot of early season precipitation when there's not a lot of nitrogen uptake, and then how we actually apply it and get it there and make sure that crop has it when it needs it. So Starter nitrogen fertilizer is still a recommended practice. We still have are generating data that clearly shows, shouldn't be a surprise to most, but clearly shows that nitrogen fertilizer as a starter does have advantages. It nearly universally will get you to silking faster, and at grain harvest will get you at least a percentage point of moisture in terms of that grain moisture. So there's advantages in terms of crop maturity, but not always in terms of yield per se, but there's a lot of instances when that happens. And so when we think about applying nitrogen as a starter, 2x2 is still our recommended practice over in-furrow. We recognize that is a tax. It takes more time to for that, and in-furrow applications is attractive, especially with larger planters, and just thinking about the time it takes. But we have seen plenty of examples of in-furrow seed injury, and that has real consequences that translate into yield at harvest time. And in particular with in-furrow, just we caution folks to be very careful and considerate, and just be conscious of salt and salt index and how much salt you're actually putting in contact with that seed, especially when you're stacking products, right? And so we've seen this where UAN by itself might be fine, but then you add, say, thiosol or some other high salt product, and then you've got issues. So again, in-furrow is a viable option, but we just really caution people when they're doing that. And it's also important to recognize that with 2x2, your rate can really, we can put on 40, 60 pounds in a 2x2 application and be okay. But in the pop-up or the in-furrow application, it's much, much less than that. So we did some work with late season nitrogen, and work from Ohio, work from Indiana kind of points to the same thing, where it's not an essential practice. We believe that it's an effective practice as a rescue treatment. And what I mean by that is, if nitrogen is, we have conditions of very wet spring where we have a lot of loss potential, either through leaching or denitrification. Then coming in later, say after V8 or V10, and doing some kind of high boil Y drop application can be ineffective as a rescue treatment. So we can see yield advantages when doing that. And it's not to say that, when we do run late season nitrogen, we don't see yield advantages, but one of the big pieces of that is that you can often cut back a little bit on your nitrogen rate and have some savings there, but it does require, of course, additional application. So there's trade-offs with that piece. And so we can talk more about that if there's questions, but I'm going to move on. Okay. So for nitrogen, we talk about source, timing, placement. A big one that it comes down to is nitrogen rate. Like, how much should we apply, right? And so just in case you're not familiar, a change with the tri-state is thinking about different nitrogen rate framework, and thinking not just applying to, say, maximize yields, but actually trying to maximize profitability. Okay, so this is a very simple economic model that really six states across the main corn belt have adopted, and this MRT and this maximum return to nitrogen. It's important to know that each state has its own recommendations, and from data that's been conducted within each one of those states. And it's really just a simple tool. We don't believe it's the end all be all, but it's a starting point for nitrogen recommendations. And the crux of this is, for every additional pound of nitrogen I apply, am I actually going to see an economic benefit to that? We understand that if we apply 180 versus 240, we might get an additional, a few bushels from that 240, or maybe 240 versus 200. But is that extra 40 pounds N or 60 pounds N actually going to pay for itself? And most of the time, vast majority of the time, the answer is no to that. And so this is something that recognizes that. It's found, Iowa State House is the tool right here. This is what it looks like if you click on it. Sorry, I'll put that link up a little bit longer. But you come to a website that looks exactly like this, and you select your single price or multiple price, and you ask for, you know, the state that you're interested in. So here we selected that we're paying 40 cents a pound for nitrogen, and we're getting $4 a bushel for corn. Okay. When it does that, it spits out a MRTN, a recommended maximum return to nitrogen. That's at 180 pounds, and it encompasses this range of 160 to 196. Okay. And we could get into this. In the interest of time, I'll probably kind of gloss over this, but really what it does is it takes your gross return, subtracts your input cost. This is nitrogen fertilizer costs. And when end fertilizer prices are creeping up like they're doing this year, especially depending on the source, we can see that this red line is what we're actually trying to achieve, which is the optimal. So we subtract this green line, or our costs, our fertilizer costs, from our gross return, and it gets our net. And this is really profitability. So we fertilize when we believe that that's going to be most profitable. Okay, so requires a little bit different way to think about it, but we believe that with the fluctuating prices of both corn and fertilizer that we've really seen over the last 10 years, this is a really nice, very simple starting point. Okay, but there's been lots of comparisons looking at different, you know, farmer rates versus MRTN, or you know, different tools out there, Climate View or Encirca, or whatever it might be, you know, Adaptin versus MRTN. And there's a lot of times when MRTN actually comes out ahead, or it doesn't, you know, perform any worse. And again, the simplicity of this, in my mind, as a starting point, is a really nice feature. Okay. So for Ohio specifically, this is based on 228 nitrogen rate trials. So these are replicated, randomized nitrogen rate trials that we have conducted across the state. A tremendous amount of effort that's gone into this. And we can see that when this is nitrogen fertilizer and price per dollar per pound, as columns, and then the price that you expect to receive for every bushel of corn grain. You can see when nitrogen prices are low and corn prices are good, our nitrogen rate increases. And when corn prices are in the barrel and nitrogen prices are high, our rate really you know, gets reduced to try to maximize profitability, not just yield. And so we know we might be leaving a little bit of yield on the table here, but if, you know, the economics work out as such that if you're paying a fair amount for end fertilizer and you're not getting much for grain, then that's really where it's going to optimize the profitability. So that's our kind of our new framework. It's really not terribly new. We've had this in place for you know, several years, but it's been not kind of fully integrated into the tri-state as a document. And so, you know, we just want to point that out, that this is a major piece in terms of cost of production for corn. Okay. And so let's talk about PNK recommendations, and we'll talk a little bit about, we've done a little bit to tweak the framework for our build and maintain framework for PNK. Okay. And so very generally, there's a lot here and we don't need to worry about all of it, but we've got fertilizer rate and soil test level. So this is either soil test P or K. As our fertilizer rate, or sorry, as our soil test level increases, our fertilizer rate typically declines. Okay. And so we've got really three main assessments or phases that, depending on the soil test, we would place any given field or any given zone of a field in. It would be either in deficient, which is below that critical level, where a yield response to fertilizer is much more likely. It would be either optimal, which would be between the critical level and the maintenance limit. This, when we're above that critical level, our yield response to fertilizer is not expected, but we really apply as much fertilizer as we remove, as much nutrient as we remove in that grain to maintain that soil test level all the time. Okay. And then when we hit our maintenance limit, instead of drawdown, which is an extra buffer we've really gotten rid of that just to simplify things. We don't believe you need that. And so we're calling this sufficient, and there's no real agronomic reason to apply fertilizer. It's not very unlikely to see a yield response or see any sort of return to that investment, okay? The timing here is important too. So when you're below that critical level, we say apply a fertilizer, either P or K, immediately before you actually plant the next crop, because we believe that you're in risk of seeing a yield loss. When you're in that optimal level, above that critical level, we say sometime in the rotation. And of course, when you're sufficient, again, no reason to fertilize. So a lot of work has gone into this, and we'll just touch on that real briefly, but here's really the take-home point, the new soil test levels for P and K. And so one of the changes that we've done is we've moved completely to Malic 3. And for phosphorus, it used to be based on Bray P. And for potassium and other cations, it used to be based on ammonium acetate. But now we're really aligning our recommendations to what soil test labs are running as the default extractant, which is this Malic 3 extractant, okay? For phosphorus for corn and beans, it's 20 to 40 part per million. That's really the optimal place that we recommend you keep your soil test levels at. And then for potassium, another major change is that we used to be scaled, critical level was scaled by CEC, and we just really didn't see any evidence that there was a need for that. We were the only, really, the tri-state was the only state in the north central region to actually, manage K that way. And it just seems like we, again, found no evidence that that was necessary. We recognize that there's sandy soils and then loamy and clay soils. And so less than, say, 5 milliequivalents of a CEC per 100 gram, we have a little bit lower of a Malic 3 optimal range for potassium. But most of the soils that we're going to encounter in the state, we're going to suggest 120 to 170 part per million as that optimal range to keep your soils in, okay? So if it's a greater than 5 CEC, if it's not a sandy soil, then 120 to 170. So this simplifies our numbers and kind of the process in terms of understanding where we're recommending you keep your soils at. Of course, for wheat and alfalfa, we've got a little bit different with phosphorus, but we'll stick to corn for this talk. So again, just to show that we've done a bunch of work to relate Bray P to Malic 3 P. Here's some, if you're interested, there's a link right here. You'll notice that if you remember, 15 to 30 used to be our numbers. Now it's 20 to 40 for corn and phosphorus, but it's a function that Malic 3 actually extracts a little bit more, about 35% more than Bray. So there's, again, if you're interested in these things, there's a fact sheet that kind of explains these conversions, simple conversions to go back and forth between Bray P and Malic 3 phosphorus, ammonium acetate potassium, and Malic 3 potassium. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work with the PNK. We had some long-term trials that Robert Mullen started in 2006. Ed Lentz, Greg Labarge, Harold Waters were all involved in this. And we, the proverbial we here, ran fertilizer rates that had P and K as 0, a truly unfertilized, a 1x or at the removal rate, and then 2 to 3 time removal rate. I'm just going to show you some yield data. There's a lot to be said about this, but I'm just kind of going to cut to the chase. Again, a lot here. We've got corn. This is, I didn't label this, I apologize. This up top here is phosphorus response, and then down here on the bottom is potassium response. Okay, it says corn and corn, but that's labeled incorrectly. So, it is all corn, but this is phosphorus trials and then potassium trials. Okay, you can see over time, we've got our northwest side, our western. So this is Wood County, this is Clark County, and this is Wayne County. And we've got our 3 different levels of P or K fertilizer treatment here, okay? So we've got the red is a truly unfertilized. This light blue is a at removal rate of P or at removal rate of K, and then a 2 to 3x. And then these little dashed lines are really when those soil test levels in the unfertilized plots draw down and went below that critical level, okay? You can look over time here and see that there are some trends, but mostly that trend is variability with the growing season. Particularly Western with potassium had some instances where, especially in these later years when we're cropping for say 5, 6, 7 years without adding K fertilizer, we start to see that in big ways show up in some of these sites in Western. But some of the other sites, say at Northwest, when we never reach below that critical level, there's really no evidence that fertilizing here actually made any differences in yield, okay? So we can take these pieces and then kind of add them up from an observation where we're looking at statistical differences between when we applied fertilizer and either increased or decreased yields. Okay, so for corn, we had across all three of these sites, we had 108 observations where we applied a fertilized versus non-fertilized control. 22 of those resulted in a yield increase, and 3 actually resulted in a yield decrease. Okay. For potassium, 8 resulted out of the 108 in a yield increase and 2 in a decrease. And when we split those up for when observations were either below the critical level, these red pieces, or above the critical level, we can see the vast majority of the time when we saw a yield bump from fertilizer, it was when that critical level was below, or that soil test level was below the critical level, okay? Same with potassium here, 7 out of the 8 times it was when we were below that critical level, all right? Then we'll talk very quickly, you've probably all heard me talk about this before, but our on-farm trials that we ran for 5 years, part of this recommendation is really important piece. We looked at, a lot of different nutrients in crops, diversity of different soils in Ohio. Really happy with the buy-in that we got and kind of how much data we were able to generate. And I'm not going to get into all of the nitty-gritty here, but this is really just kind of the high-level piece of it. For phosphorus, we ran 54 corn trials. Majority of those trials had relatively high, this is an average number here across all 54 trials, but we averaged 57 part per million. And you recall that I just told you that what we recommend is 20 to 40. And so we're actually really not going to be expecting yield responses to this, right? We just had a handful, about 3 or 4 from this 54 trials. We had good corn yields, average 192 bushel. When we applied P fertilizer on average, we got a 3.6 bushel per acre increase, okay? And that ranged from -20 to +22, because these are large on-farm strip trials and some fair amount of field variability that we encounter when we do these types of things. For potassium in corn, we had 33 trials. It ranged, the average soil test K was 164 part per million. So that really is in our recommended range. When we applied potassium, we basically got it on average across all 33 of these trials, about a 4 bushel yield bump, but it ranged here from -44 to almost +60 bushel per acre increase. And so, this is kind of has also been replicated in Michigan, where when we do see yield responses, they're much larger in potassium, or can be larger. That magnitude of a yield bump in potassium can be much larger than we would typically see with phosphorus. Okay, even with really low phosphorus trials, like a few of those in the study, we expect to see a very, very high yield increase, but just actually didn't see that. So it's kind of an interesting observation from there. All right, so again, didn't lay out the most convincing argument of all time, but I'll just tell you, we have a lot of information to have a lot of confidence that these soil test levels are actually, not terribly different than what they were in the 1995 recommendations. They've been tweaked a little bit, but we feel confident that this is a very good starting point and just guideposts for managing P&K, okay? I will mention also that we did a lot of work looking at grain nutrient concentration and figuring out how many pounds of P2O5 or K2O per bushel we're removing. We can see these 1995 numbers for corn, and then here's our new data based on, a couple thousand data points, trials on all these, trials that we looked at. We saw modest decreases in P2O5 and then pretty substantial decreases in K2O. So our potassium nutrient removal rates on a per bushel basis have really dropped. That nutrient concentration in the grain has dropped over time. And that's likely due to, just selecting for yield. As hybrids get more and more productive, we're just seeing those crops doing more with less and packing more energy, more carbohydrate or starch into that grain relative to K or P. I want to talk, running out of time, so I'm just trying to wrap up here, but I want to talk a little bit about sulfur. This is work that we really haven't put out yet. It's not part of the tri-states, but we'll have it out sometime by the summer. We went through and from we kind of compiled sulfur for corn and other crops as well. Look, we've got about maybe a little over 100 site years or trials that the collective Ohio State University has conducted over the last, say, 7-8 years. For corn, we had 27 counties represented. Again, from these years of 2013 to 2020. 52 total trials in corn that actually had these are again, mostly on farm, but randomized and replicated where we do some sort of sulfur plus treatment versus not. And so that's often gypsum, it could be ammonium sulfate, it could, the source varied, the rates varied. But the reality is that we saw out of 52 trials, we saw 5 significant increases in grain yield and actually 3 significant decreases in corn grain yield when we had sulfur. And those were in instances where we had in furrow sulfur application. So again, just being careful about when we're making pop-up fertilization and thinking about salts, because those can have real world consequences and actually end up hurting yields, as you're well aware. So 33 of we had 52 total trials in corn. 33 we actually measured ear leaf response. We had 8 of those actually saw a significant bump in that ear leaf sulfur concentration. And then out of the 25 trials that we measured grain sulfur, we saw 4. We actually had a statistically significant bump. Okay, so again, this is not like it's not totally finalized yet, but we're in a pretty good spot to start sharing some of this information. And then I'll just share this graph, which is looking at, we can here this table is talking about statistically significant responses, but what if we're only at like a couple bushels or 5 bushels and we see a lot of variability between reps? Well, we might not see that as statistically significant. So let's just look at it in terms of the numbers and calculating it as a percent difference, okay? So here's percent difference. When we see decreases here, when it's below this dashed red line of 0, that actually means when we fertilize with sulfur, whether it be gypsum or AMS or thiosol, we saw decreases. It yielded less overall. And then here we see above this red line increases. So really 44% of our trials, less than half of our trials when we added sulfur actually showed any sort of positive increase in grain yield, whether that be significant or not. And there's really no clear pattern based on year or county where the trial is conducted. Just, good information. It tells me that we're not, this is not a dire situation where everyone needs to be fertilizing with sulfur if you're growing corn. We've seen different responses, especially if you go farther west, say in Iowa, where their yields are typically better than ours and removal rates are higher. They're not getting the sulfur deposition that we're getting at least twice as much sulfur deposition through rainfall than say Iowa is. So again, just thinking about sulfur, we're going to continue to monitor this, but we don't feel like there's a tremendous need. There's instances, we're very aware of where low organic matter or cool soils where we might have some sulfur mineralization issues, but we're just not seeing it for corn production across the state. And then, so in light of that, secondary micronutrients, there's really no major changes. Soils and tri-state typically supply sufficient nutrients of the secondaries and the micros, but there's of course special cases that do exist. And I'll just say, like, what about boron and zinc? We hear about this all the time, boron and zinc. We've ran trials and tried to find this. We have really been horribly unable to find meaningful responses to boron or zinc when we're talking about in corn. So, we don't have data to suggest that we need either one of these things, but obviously there's special scenarios when that happens. I'm not saying that you don't, that the crop doesn't need it, but I'm just saying that fertilization rarely results in any sort of yield response, much less a profitable yield response to pay for that. So, if you've got fields or scenarios where we do see it, where you feel confident that we do need boron or zinc for crop production, you're interested in running an on-farm strip trial, I'd be more than happy to partner with you to do that, or we can run that through eFields or something. But we get this is a perennial question. What about boron zinc micros in corn? Boy, oh boy, we've just not been able to find a lot of evidence to suggest that we need it. So with that, I'm going to end here and thank co-authors and thank funders. Checkoff dollars really funded the vast majority of these trials and thinking about revising the recommendations. So happy to take questions if we have a little bit of time. So I'll stop sharing now. So should I? Do you want me to handle the Q&A, or somebody else going to do that?
Steve, you have a few questions in the Q&A. Steve, please comment on sulfur application timing for a corn crop. Pre-emerge, broadcast, burst 2x2 versus side dress. Yeah,
it's a good question. A lot of those trials, those 52 corn trials I just showed you, a lot of that was broadcast pre-plant, but certainly not all of it. Some of it was 2x2, and almost all of it there's very little elemental trials in there. Obviously, sulfur, all sources of sulfur besides, say, elemental is a highly available source. And so we don't think it's particularly necessary that, we recognize that sulfur is lost, but if you're not dealing with elemental sulfur, when you have to, you should easily apply that in the fall and think about elemental as a cheap source of sulfur, but something that you're making that investment over multiple years and not just a single year. So I'm not convinced it's like highly necessary or highly important to really kind of recommend a single practice, but typically, if we feel like sulfur is needed, then any sort of pre-plant or broadcast or 2x2, all those work well. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So there's a question about 28 prices being above what you have in your charts. So is there a way to adjust the prices or anything?
Absolutely. You can go to that website. You can go to, we should throw it in the chat here, but it's, let me just go.osu.edu/corn-n-rate. I think that is it might be rate or rates, but that will take you to the website, and you can put in whatever prices that you want, and you can see the crop response. So yeah, that's a good question. I probably should update that table based on some of the zany things that are going on with nitrogen fertilizer right now. I got that chart I literally went to the website and punched that in and created that table from numbers I was putting in. So you can put in whatever variables you want, the input prices, and get those numbers. Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So when the tri-state recommendations were reduced before, we still grew good yields depending on Mother Nature. I've noticed soil test fertility levels declining below sufficiency levels, and now the tri-state recommendations have been reduced again. So how are we to keep decent soil fertility levels to grow good corn if good corn yields if the tri-state recs keep going lower? Won't it eventually catch up to us and cut yields?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I'd say that, I'd push back a little bit and say that we've really cut rates. If you go to the original document, the new tri-state document, and you scroll all, or like scroll, if you're to PDF, scroll all the way down to the bottom, you can look at what the 1995 recommendations are versus the new ones, and they're largely consistent. The main difference is if you're in really high CEC soils with potassium, that's where we're seeing where the reductions have been a little bit more. And with potassium, what we've done is are actually when you're in that maintenance range, it's the exact same fertilizer recommendation, but it's just based on the removal rates on a per bushel basis. Okay, and we've got very good information to know, on average, when you're removing corn, what the removal rate is. So I'd say that we need to look. So my answer to that question is, first of all, I don't think these are largely similar recommendations to what before. The concept that we've really reduced things, it's not really it's not true if you actually look at the numbers. Number two, I think that we do need to think in kind of a more comprehensive way about the systems that we're doing, and we've had a lot of reductions in rotation, and just thinking about growing corn, soybeans compared to what fertility was, how we grew crops, say 25, 30 years ago. And I'm very well aware of the economics and what's driving a lot of this, but the reality is that it's not just building soil fertility is not just about going out and running a spreader and putting a nutrient down. It's more than that. We have to think about fertility more comprehensively and think about it from the concept of soil health and building soil health, and what are the other things that we're doing with controlled traffic. If there's other ways to get cover crops into that rotation, or to think about increasing the diversity of the crops that you're growing, these are all highly, we understand these are proven ways that we're actually building the fertility, building up those organic matter pools, rather than just kind of a corn, soy, which of course is in some ways the norm, but it was not the norm 25 years ago. I mean, not to the extent that it is today, if you look at the numbers. So,
Steve, there's a question in the chat that sort of goes along with this, which is about crop removal for different genetics. So how can you talk about how that was controlled for in updating the tri-states, or how people should think about this depending on the genetics of the corn that they're using? And Peter's still on here too, I see. So if he's at his computer, he might have some thoughts on this also.
yeah, I'll say that we didn't do we had a lot of different seed companies and all kinds of genetics involved in these experiments. And if you go to that, grain fact sheet that we have out, you'll see that there's variability around, that number, right? So I don't, I don't have a great answer for that, except that we do recognize that there is variability and that removal rates do vary based on the field. Genetics has a role in that, I'm certain. We don't know to what extent or how to account for that, but we would just say it's a ballpark figure. You can hedge and say, well, maybe I'm not in the 50th percentile, maybe I'm at the 70th percentile, and bump your number up a little bit if you so choose to. But as a ballpark figure, I think that's what we're dealing with. So
Thank you. Now there's a question a few people have upvoted. Have you run any trials with Pivot Bio?
Pivot Bio? No, I'm not familiar with that. Nope, I haven't.
So whoever I see, there's a few people who've liked that. If you have more thoughts on that or want to expand on that, you can do that.
Sure. I mean, I'll just, of course, the generic, like we're always willing to run trials and work with growers or do product evaluation. We've done a fair amount of product evaluation, but not with that. Yeah.
Okay. Are you working with sulfur on soybean and timing of that?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, Laura Lindsay's done some work on that, and we have as well. Again, sometime in the next several months, you'll see we'll be rolling out some more information. But we had about maybe between Laura and others, myself, probably about, I don't quote me on this, but it's like somewhere about 30 to 35 trials in soybeans, and we saw pretty similar responses as corn, but we did see maybe a little bit more of those observations were positive. Maybe a little bit higher percentage, but it's still, around like the 5 or 10% of the trials we saw significant. I don't know if you have anything to add, Laura.
Nope. Sorry about that too. I was supposed to do questions for you, Steve, but then as soon as I touched my computer, it restarted. So
Oh no.
I didn't mean to ghost you.
Okay, no problem. Thanks.
So what about the rule of thumb for 10-to-1 ratio nitrogen to sulfur? Are we saying we get enough sulfur from mineralization?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the 10-to-1, well, it depends on, I guess, how much credence you put in that. But, we've typically found that, and we've done a fair amount of work, say, in organic systems at this point, looking at certified organic systems and sulfur application. We think that those are the systems where it might benefit the most, because those are typically, they don't have, they're more often nitrogen limited than, say, a system that's using, say, UAN or conventional synthetic nitrogen. All I can say, it's not going to be a great answer, but I'll just say that, we've just not seen, I just showed you some of the data. We just haven't seen great responses for the places that we're in. And 27 counties is a fairly good representation of the state. So we know that when we're in sandy soils, soils with pHs that are not optimized, we run into sulfur mineralization issues. We know that those are well known and documented. But other instances, majority of the soils that we encounter in the state that are being cropped, our data show that there's typically sufficient mineralization to meet the crop need, and if we add extra, it's not responding to it. So.
Okay, thanks, Steve. A follow-up. If we have phosphorus levels over 150 parts per million, is it a good idea to supply more zinc, as high phosphorus levels tend to tie up zinc?
That's an excellent question. I don't know it. There's a lot of issues with that in other soils, not say in Ohio, but my sense of that, if we've got phosphorus levels that high, those are typically going to be manured soils that get us up to 150, not always, but often. And if we've got a history of manure application, we're typically going to have higher organic matter levels and lots of micronutrients that are available through mineralization of that. So yeah, we've never looked at that. I've never seen anything about that, but just kind of thinking through this is just thinking high, P levels over 150, 200, those are sites that have had a history of manure, and we very, very, very rarely run into micronutrient issues unless there's pH. pHs are really whacked out when we have fields with a history of manure. Manure is a great tool for alleviating any concerns with micronutrient deficiencies.
All right. The MRTN calculator gives a percent maximum yield for the given rate. In the Ohio trials, what N rates and yields make up the top end that may be above MRTN? Understanding this may be unprofitable, just wondering what is the 100%?
Yeah, so we when we run nitrogen rate trials, it depends, but often we use 250 pounds as our highest rate, sometimes 300. It depends again who's running them and who, you know, what they want to do. But and you know, make no mistake, you know, nitrogen is maddening because the right rate can be 60 pounds. The right rate is sometimes 0 pounds, and sometimes the right rate is 250 pounds, right? And that's a big function of like the year that we're in and the losses, and the, you know, the field that you're in, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's very productive fields out there that we have one at Western Branch, and I don't have a presentation together, but we've looked at data, and you know, putting 100 pounds of N down is not what anyone's going to do, but I would argue that that's, you know, far more profitable of putting 100 pounds of nitrogen down in a corn soybean rotation, and you know, every other year, than putting 200 pounds in a farm like that. And so again, that's a bit heresy, I understand, but we, you know, the range really does vary. It depends on the site and everything, but we have trials in there when we applied 250 pounds and we had really heavy rainfall and no rescue treatment to go in and apply additional N. And 250 pounds that's the optimal rate, economically optimal, profitable rate, you know? So we wish that nitrogen was not such a stinker, but man, it is.
There's several questions still in the Q&A. Would you be able to stick around and type answers to some of those?
I'd be happy to. Yeah.
Get started with Pierce's talk to keep us on time this morning.
Thank you. Yep, I'd be happy to do that. Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Yeah, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to sit here and stick around and try to answer these questions. Okay. Yep.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thanks for all of you for asking such good questions.